When I was young, I never imagined that we could do what we've done.
Membertou, a Mi'kmaq community in Unamugi.
Accountability is a big part of, being successful.
A model community. But
so do you think it'll ever get fixed? Huh? Do you think it'll ever get fixed?
This house here?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
That's not a reality for some First Nations. How do First Nations seek accountability? Are there traditional solutions?
We have the opportunity through our clan structures to be able to provide checks and balances.
There are a lot of band councils that have integrity, a lot of chiefs that are doing the right thing. But unfortunately, like with any other group, there are also some bad apples.
Rob Louis is the founder of a group that helps band members fight for accountability.
Band council corruption is real. Let's be very clear about that. It is real. But does it happen everywhere? No.
Rob's uncle, Wayne Louis, took on council in his home community, Lower Kootenay, British Columbia, over questionable payments to chief and council.
The Louis versus Louis case was a 6-year-long saga that included 2 different courts, as well as an arbitration hearing. And to fame, my late uncle Wayne Louis was the plaintiff in that case.
The defendants were chief and council, and Rob Louis' brother was a councillor.
For me, I didn't look at the Louis versus Louis case as it's my brother. It just so happened that my brother was on the band council.
In 2015, the BC Court of Appeal gave Wayne Louis a victory. The court ordered the chief and band councillors to return a cash bonus they'd given themselves for completing a land claim. Because the court said council has a fiduciary obligation to the band members.
That case is the leading authority on band council fiduciary duty in relation to band monies.
A fiduciary duty means the chief and council must put the best interest of community members before their own interest when dealing with band-held money. It's about trust.
The buck stops with the chief and council. The chief and council are responsible, for what happens in our community.
Terry Paul has been chief of Membertou for 37 years.
I just wanted to move our community out of economic depression and poverty.
Membertou went from a struggling community to an economic and entertainment hub in the region. New housing, strong infrastructure, and an accessible chief.
Pretty well everybody knows my number in the community, and people call me, and I feel that I'm very open and I'm very responsive to that.
Chief and council meet regularly with the community members.
And their requests are dealt with at various levels of Membertou governance and the Membertou administration.
Chief Paul says secrecy is needed sometimes.
There are instances, for example, the business deal that we just did, that we had to sign non-disclosure agreements.
That deal was the Clearwater seafood purchase.
The $1 billion deal, partnered with British Columbia company Premium Brands Foods, is the largest Indigenous-led seafood investment, led by Membertou and Mi'kmaq First Nations and a coalition of 5 Mi'kmaq communities.
News of the Clearwater deal came in the midst of ongoing hostilities towards Mi'kmaq fisheries. This story about a fisher from Sebaganagadeg First Nation happened just days before the deal went public.
Fucking Indian!
It sounds like a racial slur, and 6 gunshots in the background. This video was sent to Jolene Marr last week. Although it's difficult to see what is exactly going on, Marr took it as a threat.
My whole body just overcome with fear, because I've seen how these individuals acted in public.
Mi'kmaq fish and lobster harvesters were targeted with protest and violence in the months prior to the deal's announcement.
Non-Indigenous fishermen reacted with violence after Sabaganagati First Nation launched their moderate livelihood fishery.
After months of violent protests, the announcement boosted morale for the Mi'kmaq.
I feel really fortunate to first have this opportunity to acquire such a major company like this, you know, and a fishing company where part of our values are. And even much more thrilled that we were able to accomplish that. And, you know, it's, to us, it's a monumental deal, a generational deal. And I think a lot of the people in the country seen it that way too.
Paul says it wouldn't have happened without an accountable chief and council.
Well, without good governance, you're not going to have good business. So they both complement each other.
Well, I think there needs to be a governance regime and set policies that people have to follow, and they have to apply to everybody.
John Paul heads the Atlantic Policy Congress, an advocacy organization representing East Coast First Nations. He says clear business plans can add accountability.
And articulate a plan about how you're going to be accountable for things that that business does on behalf of the community, especially if it's a business that's wholly owned by the band.
Money from the feds to First Nations is audited. But when bands run businesses, like fishing for example, those own source revenues are not, unless the band has those policies in place.
Most communities use that own source revenue to enhance services in their own communities, to fill gaps in services not provided by the federal or provincial government.
Membertou built a school with its own money in 2014.
That's why leadership and management rules need to be consistent. Managers have to be, and leaders have to be, accountable for what they do.
And corporations, boards, or committees can be developed alongside.
Every community decides how those businesses operate, and in many cases set up a development corporation to manage and provide oversight to those businesses in the communities. But I think that the fundamental principle with all those, including with the development corporation, is to have good governance, basically, and really becoming transparent in the business plan.
It's about keeping credibility, something Rob Louie lost in 2003.
And my alcoholism came first. And the consequence of that was I didn't show up to work at a law firm for a week. As a result, my privilege with the Law Society of BC was terminated.
Louis has a law degree, but isn't a practicing lawyer. He had troubles with the Law Society of British Columbia. In 2017, he was ordered to repay money.
I found myself totally broken on the downtown east side. My beloved dog Gertie and I ended up homeless. I found myself there after years of substance abuse.
Louis knows what it's like to struggle and says it's not always about the person, but the system.
It's rare to find a chief that is inherently evil. There's a culture that was developed over the decades where the financial system within a band was lax.
Lax finances was part of the Louis versus Louis decision.
In that case, the chief and council had a financial policy that was left in draft. And the Court of Appeal said, no, you can't make a final decision on a draft policy. It has to be a final policy.
One of the biggest systemic issues is the continuing effect of the Indian Act.
The Indian Act really does strike at the heart of our traditional ways of sharing power and looking out for one another. It gathers power into too few a number of hands.
John Burrows is an Anishinaabe. He's the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria.
The governments wanted to control Indians, and so they did that by creating a hierarchical structure. And with that hierarchical structure, like you mentioned earlier, they put an Indian agent in charge of that.
John Paul says that created a dependency that still exists.
It's not gone. It's a legacy, basically. People's mindset are still focused on the federal government as doing everything for them or controlling everything on our behalf.
That was part of our life, the Indian agent and the Indian Act, for sure. I tried to do everything not to have to follow the Act.
Chief Paul says the Indian Act is too cumbersome for the fast pace of business. He says accountability is the real key to success.
We also have ISO certification, and that tells the business world or anyone that they don't have to worry about our management capabilities and accountability.
ISO, an internationally recognized standard for management, had an immediate impact.
I think it was a day or two after our announcement that we had ISO certification, and that was Lockheed Martin, an aerospace firm. And they wanted to meet with us, and they themselves told us that if you weren't ISO certified, we wouldn't have called you.
Membertou took control over its own destiny and finances. On the West Coast, Louis was trying to do the same in his personal life.
I woke up one morning in a park on the downtown east side with my dog Gertie, and I told Gertie, I said, Dad's going to get help. And I remember Gertie's ears went up, and she started to kind of almost dance around me. She was so hyper and happy.
After the break, Louis starts walking the road to recovery, and he takes on a new fight for accountability.
When a band member has a problem, who do they call? So approximately 2.5 years ago, my beloved dog Gertie and I were at a place called Oppenheimer Park. I started walking aimlessly. This wasn't the life that I wanted to live. I found myself reaching out for help for the first time in my life.
Eventually, Louis found help. A health services center offering programs that put him back on his feet.
I walked to a place called Kalala Lalem in Vancouver's downtown east side.
And he wanted to pay it forward.
It was at that time that it occurred to me, as I looked around and saw all my brothers and sisters, where do we go for help? When a band member has a problem, who do they call?
2 years later, Louis is president of a nonprofit organization.
And the name speaks for itself. the Band Members Alliance and Advocacy Association of Canada.
It's called BMAC for short.
And I'd heard of Rob before, just from the case that he was involved in back in 2015, the Louis v. Louis case.
Evan Duffy says 90% of his law practice is Indigenous issues.
I've been in private practice for the last 6 years, where I've been, working primarily for bands and band members.
Duffy does pro bono work for BMAC when Rob Louis calls.
He explained sort of some of the aims of BMAC and what he's trying to do, and it struck a chord with me. There's not a lot of resources out there for that, so I really respect what he's doing, and I wanted to help him with it.
Louis didn't just set out to recover. He had to rebuild his reputation. Now, he's taking steps to get reinstated by the Law Society of British Columbia.
Part of my journey back included reconnecting with the legal profession.
Louis reached out to old colleagues.
I found that there are some lawyers that just want to do the right thing and give back to society, generally through pro bono services. So I partnered with some old legal peers from Vancouver and Edmonton. I rolled up my sleeves and I began working on the Articles of Incorporation for a national organization dedicated to helping band members get access to justice.
And he got funding.
We are fortunate to have CIBC as one of our principal funders, and they provided some donations to us. The BC Law Foundation recently provided us with a $10,000 grant so that we can be an intervener in a band election case that is going before the federal court.
BMAC is headquartered in Fort McMurray, Alberta.
This is really good fry bread.
Louis lives there with his partner, Lisa Crookedneck.
I met Lisa about 1.5 years ago.
Lisa Crookedneck is from Minnestickwin Lake Cree Nation in Saskatchewan.
I need to start speaking up. I have nothing to lose. I have no home to call home.
The community of Minnestickwin is struggling with a lack of housing and infrastructure.
There's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there to go back to. Nothing's changing. It's been the same. People have lost hope in our community.
Minnestickwin is a small reserve about 350 kilometers northwest of Saskatoon.
I think it's time that people need to put someone in there that's going to be vocal for the elders, for the families, for the youth, for the children.
We attempted to get the band side of the story. APTN emailed and called the chief of Minnestickwin, but never heard back. Crookedneck's concerns are echoed in the many emails and phone calls APTN Investigates receives daily. People feel powerless. Louis gets similar emails and phone calls.
We generally will, first of all, hear the band member out, and more often than not, they just want to be heard. Or sometimes
he sees a strong power imbalance.
Typically, the chief and council have all the resources, all the money, and all the manpower behind them, and a band member doesn't.
Duffy sees it too.
It's just so resource intensive when you go against a First Nation, as they typically will use band funds to defend themselves, and certainly a band member doesn't have that luxury.
Chief Terry Paul says you can be a Goliath and still be fair. It's no secret.
Any Indigenous community that's asked for our what our procedures are, what our policies are, we freely give that to them. And I feel that our repayment is that community moves up.
But when First Nations do struggle, where can their members turn? There's no ombudsman on reserve.
We need to be able to deal with these questions in-house, within our nations, within our communities. That's a part of self-determination.
John Burrows says democracy and accountability problems aren't new to First Nations.
And we also have our challenges, and we would have those challenges regardless of colonialism or not. In fact, we had those challenges before Europeans came along. That's why we have our laws to deal with when people would corrupt our systems in different ways.
He says those cultural practices can be combined with colonial legal tools.
We have the opportunity through our clan structures to be able to provide checks and balances. We could create dispute resolution structures, that is tribal courts or peacemaking courts, so that if there's a disagreement within our community, we could go to our own laws, go to our own processes, our principles to be able to get this done. There's so many opportunities that we have at our fingertips to be able to do this work in a better way.
John Paul says financial accountability should come from Indigenous people.
I think an Indigenous Auditor General would be much more sensitive to Indigenous values and Indigenous ways of doing business, and would contribute greatly to the betterment of those businesses and the betterment of our communities, way more than anybody from outside trying to assess or measure the value of what we're doing in our own communities.
I'm a believer that we cannot operate from the outside looking in. We need our people to be on the inside, whether it's in the Liberal government, the Conservative government, and particularly in the judiciary. We have to regain the trust within ourselves. A process is only as good as the people in it.
We became displaced people. You know, people don't think about that. We were displaced. We became nobody.
When we were in Roche River, we were happy, you know, and we looked after each other. But then when we were displaced, it was like we're pulled apart. It was just like that, eh?
It's the disappearance of their home, you know, most people can go home. Most people can. Not people from Rush River.